We're really very pleased to be hosting Susan Neiman this afternoon. Susan is a moral philosopher who over the years has shown a particular interest and talent for political and cultural commentary as well. Educated at Harvard, she spent the 1990s teaching philosophy at Yale and at Tel Aviv University. And for the past nearly 20 years, she served as director of the Einstein Forum, which is a state-run foundation in Potsdam, Germany, that brings together thinkers from around the world. Susan's major works have included a memoir, Slow Fire, about her experience as an American Jewish woman living in Berlin in the 1980s, and several engaging book-length philosophical studies, Evil and Modern Thought, Moral Clarity, and Why Grow Up? In her new book, Learning from the Germans, Susan examines German efforts to atone for Nazi atrocities and identifies lessons for how the United States might come to terms. Everything all right over there? Okay. So the book looks at the German experience in coming to terms with its Nazi past and identifies lessons for how the United States might come to terms with its legacy of slavery and racism. The book draws on Susan's own background as a white woman who grew up in the South in the Civil Rights era, and as a Jewish woman who spent much of her adult life living in Berlin. And in researching this book, she moved from Berlin to Mississippi for a bit to do some research. This is really quite an insightful, instructive book, and it's an important contribution to the process of remembering, confronting, and making amends. Of course, it comes at a time where lots of signs exist in this country that our own efforts to deal with the legacy of slavery and racial hatred are far from complete. Just consider the controversies over Confederate monuments, the resurgence of white nationalist activity, the rise of the Black Lives Movement, and the unresolved issue of reparations. Now, Susan will be in conversation here with Diane McWhorter, a journalist and author who also grew up in the South and has written extensively and powerfully about race and the history of civil rights. Her 2001 book, Carry Me Home, which was a dramatic account of the civil rights era's climactic battle in Birmingham, won the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. More recently, Diane's been at work on a book about Werner von Braun and his development of efforts in helping getting us to the moon. And she might talk about that too if you ask her. Anyway, please join me in welcoming both Susan and Diane.
Thank you. So, hello, Susan. Welcome to my city.
I'm so glad to see you again. We're friends, one should say.
And I will introduce Susan by saying that I, as a Southerner, I am not the most linear storyteller. And I'm also recovering from a concussion. That's actually true. I didn't tell you that. But I met Susan some time ago. My daughter and I were in Berlin, and my daughter had just fallen in love with this classmate of hers, a teenage classmate of hers at the JFK school. And all I would hear about was Shira, Shira, Shira. And then one day she came home and said, "Mom, I think you and Shira's mom have the same editor." And I said, "Oh, really?" I was at my desk and I said, "What's her name?" She said, "Susan." I said, "What's her last name?" She said, "Well, Shira's last name is Wagner." And so I looked up Susan Wagner. and up pops a writer who was an astrologer. And I said, oh, well, Becky has kind of branched out in the past. And then, so I said, okay. And then, and actually there's a picture of the writer. And I said, is that Susan? She said, yeah, it could be. So anyway, couple of weeks later, she comes home and says, no, Susan's last name is Neiman. So then I Google it, and up pops Susan being interviewed by Bill Moyers on what was the book?
Evil in Modern Thought.
Evil in Modern Thought. And I went, okay, that's more like it. So that's how Susan and I came to meet. And as Brad said, I'm working on a book about Werner von Braun, ex-Nazis in Alabama, building the moon rocket at the time of George Wallace. And so when I heard that Susan was taking on that topic, like a few decades later, I was just delighted. I read Susan's first book, Slow Fire, about her time as a Fulbright coming to Berlin after graduate school or during graduate school. It was one of these books. It's about being a Jew in Berlin, and it's one of these books where everything in it you're interested in. And the anecdote that has stuck with me for 13 years was about her taking her. It's sort of her. She would have to think about whether she would divulge that she was Jewish, because it would just sort of subtly shift the molecules in the room if they found out she was Jewish. And mostly it was that people felt the need to express their philo-Semitism. And so anyway, she tells an anecdote about taking her, sending her young son to the kindergarten that's at the main synagogue in town that was burned during Kristallnacht. And so one of her friends says, oh, you must feel so safe because there's so many police cars out front all the time. So anyway, so Susan's new book is just like that to me. It's just like every single thing in there you are interested in. It is quietly mind-blowing. It's not like a loud explosion, but just sort of like almost every page has something where you almost have to put the book down. Susan, how did you come up? Susan, as Brad said, went to Mississippi, spent some time there, but she had the idea for this book even before Trump was elected. So how did you tell us about the genesis of it?
Lots of books have a slow genesis. This one had a very particular one. I was standing in my study in Berlin in tears watching President Obama give the eulogy after the Charleston massacre. And I saw, I followed that story intensely, and Nikki Haley, of all people, taking down the flag. And I thought, wow, America is really in a moment where we're realizing we need to look at this history. I have been thinking about the Germans' relationship to their history for 30 years. Maybe this is something I can offer, okay? How to do it, how not to do it, etc. Maybe this would be a useful book to write. And I had written a little essay that got onto the internet, and actually it turned out to be a young lawyer. I thought he'd been an old, Southern good boy. I guess he's a young, good old boy. Writes to me saying, I'm a white conservative from Mississippi, and your article really interested me. Now tell me, what should we do about our statues? Should we rename things, et cetera, et cetera? And I wrote back saying, I made some suggestions based, of course, on zero knowledge of what was going on in Mississippi. Like I was thinking, so start renaming things in terms of, things for Fannie Lou Hamer. There are some things not big enough named for Fannie Lou Hamer, but anyway. I said, well, if all self-described Southern white conservatives are as thoughtful as you are, then the country's in better shape than I thought it was. Well, that was the late summer of 2015. By which time, however, this same person had already set up, he said, well, I think you should come and lecture at the University of Mississippi. And I said, Mississippi, sure. And I went down and I discovered I was a guest of an institution that's unfortunately no longer at the University of Mississippi called the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation. Black and white people in equal numbers doing really interesting social justice work, having the kinds of hard conversations that very rarely happen elsewhere about race. And I loved it. And I said, well, look, if I'm going to talk about what Americans can learn from the Germans, it would be foolish and presumptuous of me not to know more about what people are already doing now. And I said to them, can I come back? It's okay. I have a paid sabbatical coming for me. You don't need to, sponsor me, but can I come back? I don't think they really thought I would. And of course, when November 2016 came around, all of my friends said, you're going where now? But I did go and spend a half a year there. And I learned a lot and I was inspired. And the book is basically it's divided into 3 parts. The beginning talks about the legitimacy of making comparisons between the Holocaust and anything else. I hate this debate.
One thing I love about it is whenever this is a sign of German progress to me, is that whenever she mentions this topic, learning from the Germans, when she says the topic, they burst out laughing. Because,
in Germany.
Yeah, because they just feel like they still have so much work to do.
And they did it way too late. And, and I realized in Mississippi how important and actually hopeful that fact was, because when I was talking to people and I interviewed a bunch of people, and obviously I would have to, keep explaining what I was doing that I was taking up their time for. What people assumed, because the Nazi period functions in American culture, basically an inverse relation to our knowledge of it. We know a little bit about the very end of it. We don't know very much at all about what happened before Auschwitz or after. And it functions as such a symbol of absolute evil that anything that's slightly less bad than that can't be evil. And I've come to think we're outsourcing evil when we focus on the Holocaust.
And there's no sense of the slippery slope.
That's right. And so, but anyway, given that view, my new friends and colleagues in Mississippi would think, oh, the minute the war was over, everybody just got on their knees and begged for forgiveness and, cried and shame and all of that. And it wasn't like that at all. On the contrary, and this was a point where something flipped in my work on the book. Certainly for the first 20 years, West Germany as a whole, and you get instances of this even today. It was a war. A lot of people did terrible things. We suffered so much. Our cities were bombed. The flower of our youth was killed. Don't defame my grandfather. He was just defending his country. And I sort of said, hey, what does that sound like? I mean, take it away.
Right. But talk about a little bit about the whole Wehrmacht. You see over and over again that this need for heroes in this evil time. And in the scientific community, it's kind of Werner Heisenberg. Everybody wants to think he was the clean scientist. And in Nazi Germany, it was the Wehrmacht. So talk about that a little bit,
so,
as with the Confederate monuments.
Sure. So what everybody needs to know is there were 18 million men in the Wehrmacht. There was a draft on the only way to get out of fighting for the Nazi army was to do something worse, like be a concentration camp guard or a very high Nazi official.
And the Wehrmacht were all 3 of the armed services.
Right. So it's certainly not the case that every person in the Wehrmacht was a member of the Nazi Party or even, terribly committed to anything. I mean, some of them went, hated going. Most of them went, and this is really important for thinking about what happened after the war and the division between East and West Germany. There's a draft on, but you actually have to motivate soldiers. You have to tell them that they're fighting for something. Well, the Nazis didn't say, hey, pick up a gun and go and shoot defenseless old men and children in Poland. They said, protect your country from the communist invader. And the Nazis' first victims were not Jews, they were communists, and they were German communists. So that gets very important. But there was still in Germany, up until 1995, the myth that the Wehrmacht was clean, even nightly. And, they were innocent, decent men who were defending their homes. And the bad guys were the SS, and, there were a few bad apples. And it was a very poignant and powerful myth because everyone with 18 million men in arms, everybody had family members who were in it if they weren't in it themselves. And of course, historians knew this wasn't true. Historians knew that the Wehrmacht systematically committed war crimes, but it wasn't until an exhibit created by actually a friend of mine who I interview in the book at length, created an exhibit for the 50th anniversary of the war that it became a kind of national issue. It was firebombed in one place that it was shown, and there were these huge demonstrations. I didn't bring any slides because I didn't think there was a screen, but you can see these people with signs saying, grandfather was a hero, don't touch my grandfather. Now, the good news is that there were more counter demonstrators than there were demonstrators. And that 20 years after the exhibit, my friend Philipp Reemtsma says, it's amazing to me, but the claim that was so contested 20 years ago has just become automatic. It's not even, people don't even ask for proof anymore.
And do you think that will happen? Because Robert E. Lee, as most of you know, was always the sort of clean Southern general. The Southerners the old Confederates had given up on Nathan Bedford Forrest because he had founded the Ku Klux Klan, but it was like Robert E. Lee was clean. So do you think that that's going to happen eventually?
This is the good news. The first thing that I think we can learn from the Germans is that facing your violent past is really hard. And there's going to be opposition and pushback whatever you committed, because nobody wants really to face the shame of what their ancestors or their country did in their name. So, of course, Newt Gingrich is going to say something about the 1619 Project. And that
New York Times essays, yeah.
And that shouldn't be a reason for despair. On the contrary, if you look at the history of how hard it was, how long it took, how various it was, you can say, okay, we are beginning a process that I think, I thought it was beginning after the Charleston massacre, and perhaps it was, but I think it was Charlottesville that really convinced Americans that, actually, Nazis are not just a German problem. We have a problem here, and we have a history that we haven't faced. So, I don't make predictions, Diane. I was wrong about the last election. But I see lots of reasons to actually find the silver lining in this horrible historical moment that we were in, that Americans have seen through the racism of this administration how deep white supremacy goes in our history. And let's all take a moment to recall that 2 years ago, if you heard the word white supremacy, you were probably in a Department of Post-Colonial Studies. You were not reading the Washington Post or the New York Times or whatever, A lot has happened very fast. when I wrote the next to last chapter, I knew I had to write a chapter on reparations. And I actually wasn't 100% sure what I thought about reparations. I mean, I knew there were arguments of particularly some African American thinkers I respect, like Cornel West, Adolf Reed, had come out against it, saying what we need is democratic socialism. Well, I think we need democratic socialism too, but I also think even if that were to come to pass, we would need reparations. And I worked my way reading a lot of stuff, as one does when one writes, you figure out what you think. But then when I was done, and this was the end of August, I thought, oh boy, have I gone out on a limb.
So summarize what you came to.
Well, two things basically. If we become aware, and there have been some wonderful historians who've written about it, about exactly how much of American wealth was built on slavery. And number two, that slavery persisted in different forms long past the end of the Civil War. If there's just one book to read about this, I highly recommend Douglas Blackman's Slavery by Another Name, but there's a lot of work that's been done on this. If you realize how long the effects of slavery have persisted. And, my example was there's a great writer named Jean Amery, one of my heroes, an Austrian Jew, who survived Auschwitz and wrote a number of brilliant, brilliant books. He refused reparations. But if you do the thought experiment where you think, okay, supposing you have a Holocaust survivor living in Germany, which basically has a social democratic structure. So I won't go now because I know when I tell Americans what all the things that are considered rights there, that are considered benefits here, they think I'm living in paradise. It's just there's a very strong idea that healthcare, education, labor rights are not something that you call into question. So, a Holocaust survivor would have had all the things that Cornel West and Adolf Reed rightly want them to have, but wouldn't we owe them something more than what everybody got? And my conclusion was, yeah, we would. But the interesting thing was, I thought I was going way out on a limb. This is August. It was me and Ta-Nehisi Coates and who else, And I thought, wow, anybody who has, read the book so far and been convinced is going to say, no, she's gone too far. This is it. We're throwing this all away. I could not have dreamed that 5 presidential candidates would be discussing the word reparations, and we would finally have hearings in Congress. And so those are signs that seem to me that we are actually, through this awful racist administration, we are actually in the process of coming out better. What exactly is going to happen in 20 years, I can't tell you.
Well, 20 years seems to
Depends on us also, by the way.
I think my crackpot theory is that the reason there's that 20 years of amnesia, because this happened after the Civil Rights Movement too, is that the level of societal criminality is so systemic that you couldn't even figure out whom to punish, and there were so many Nazi war criminals at large that you would probably get rid of the entire or just Nazi guilty people, that you would get rid of the entire civil service structure of post-war Germany, of Adenauer's so. There were people. They didn't have to. So what was the mercy of birth?
Mercy of the late birth.
Mercy of the late birth, and it's also the kind of flip side of that is the bad luck of living too long, because that's why the Nazi war criminals who were persecuted. It was because they happened to be alive, and so many of them had died off. And you see this in the South with the cold civil rights crimes that they finally start, bringing to trial. They knew who they were back then. It's just that they didn't see it as a crime worth punishing, and now so many people have died off that you can start going after them selectively and not tie up the entire court system. I want to now.
Can I mention your other theory that I don't think is crackpot at all? And I quoted in my book. I interviewed Diane among many other people. I thought a real Southern historian. She's known to call me a carpetbagger because my family were Jewish Yankees, even though I was born in the South. When people ask the question, well, so Germany has done all of this work facing its past. What's taking the Americans so long? Is that an analogy? And your argument is we have to start from the date of the Voting Rights Act because before then, it's not just that the effects of slavery lived on in, individual prejudice. They lived on in the law. And until we got rid of all of the structurally racist laws, we can't really say that slavery ended. And so if we count from 1965, which following you, would like to do, we're not in terrible shape.
Mm-hmm. So, Susan, I want you to. I've been to many of these events, and often you can't really get a sense of the quality of the book. So, I want you to read a little passage. The Winter Institute, I think it's sort of a model for truth and reconciliation in the country.
Yeah.
And so the person that Susan's reading about is the executive director.
She was the academic director. Unfortunately, she's not anymore because for a variety of reasons, many of them having to do with political pressure from the state of Mississippi, the Winter Institute is no longer at the University of Mississippi. But she was the academic director, yeah.
So this will just give you a sense of just the mind-blowing complexities of this topic.
I'm glad you picked a passage because I wouldn't know which one to pick. I mean, okay. Jennifer Stolman was raised in a Jewish community in suburban Detroit. What made her a social justice activist? Serendipity is part of her answer. She was born on Martin Luther King's birthday and the year of his death. Her father and her aunt marched in Selma, two of the many Jews who believed that segregation was in conflict with Jewish tradition and decided to do something about it. When Jennifer describes her biography when she's training a group, however, she brings up something else. Quote, I was adopted out of the foster care system when I was almost 5, so I remember going from eating onion skin soup when there was nothing else to a purple organza bedroom. Being lifted out of the cycle of poverty into a life of privilege made her aware of the arbitrariness of social injustice at a very tender age. Racism was fierce and open at the University of Michigan in the 80s, where she became politically active while studying American history, eventually earning a PhD with a dissertation on Southern Jewish women. Quote, I had done Hebrew school, studied and taught the Talmud, lived and worked in Israel. It was enough already. I didn't want to do a PhD in Jewish history, end quote. But she was fascinated by the diary of the Jewish wife of a Georgia plantation owner. Quote, Farrakhan's claim that Jews were the principal slaveholders is a lie, but Jews have to confront their history apart from these triumphalist narratives that say we treated our slaves well and we were all civil rights activists. We've got to tell the truth. She began to read letters of Jewish women who lived in the 19th century South, appalled by what she found. Quote, women never beat their slaves, but they used the threat of sale, which was worse. When she spoke about her work at her hometown Jewish community center, she was roundly attacked by the audience, among them a number of Holocaust survivors. Quote, I had this endless faith that my community was forthright and self-reflective. Young lady, said an older man who started to roll up his sleeve to show his tattooed number, do you know how dangerous this is, the story you're telling? He accused me of sympathizing with Louis Farrakhan, who has blamed the Jewish community for racism. I said, no, I'm trying to get you to see that we are part of this history, and lying about it only expresses our anxieties. We're not fully Jewish in America if we're not fully telling the truth. Only one woman in the room supported me. It was 10 years of education in one night.
One of my favorite quotes in the book is from Todorov, and and it's he's a French Bulgarian philosopher, Bulgarian French, and it says Germans should talk about the singularity of the Holocaust. Jews should talk about its universality. And I see here that we have the sort of the kind of dueling exceptionalism, American exceptionalism and Holocaust exceptionalism, kind of keeps us from facing the universal lessons that we can, and I'm sure you're getting a lot of pushback on that from that you can't compare anything to the Holocaust, right?
You know what I find so interesting? I was so sure that I was going to get pushback on that and a number of points that I had my email address taken off my institute website. I don't do social media, so I wasn't worried about getting tirades like that. But I had my email address taken off. I have only gotten great letters. Mm-hmm. I haven't gotten one hostile commentary yet. And I was really surprised that the Times chose Deborah Lipstadt to do the review. She's a historian of the Holocaust. And I would have expected her actually to go, and I don't know her personally, to go in that direction. And she didn't. I think people are becoming, I mean, I start the book with a chapter that talks about all the differences between slavery and its aftermath and the Holocaust. Of course, there are differences. Every historical event is different. It makes no sense to say that these are equal. But I really have the sense that Americans are beginning to see that if we talk about learning the lessons of the Holocaust, if the lesson of the Holocaust is Germans shouldn't put Jews in gas chambers in 1944, this is not a lesson, you know? Mm-hmm. I mean, if we don't make some comparisons, if we don't use the beginning of the Nazi period to apply to the violence and law-breaking that we have now, and I don't just mean America. By the way, I spent a week in England, where you'll be amused by this, and it happened twice on television. They wanted me to talk about, of course, how this applied to Britain, and I think it does apply to Britain, and I think some of Brexit is absolutely fueled, first of all, by racism, and secondly, by nostalgia for the old empire. And so I said a few things about this, and the first gentleman said, "Oh, well, that's nonsense. They're two completely different things. The Nazis were about world domination," and I had the presence of mind. Thank you. I had the presence of mind to say, I thought the sun never set on the British Empire, you know? And as far as it's being far away, I thought colonialism ended after the Second World War. So I actually got pushback in England, which I think is, has not yet come as far as we're beginning to come in this country.
Well, I know when I took my daughters to Buchenwald, the concentration camp, they're half Jewish, and I said to them, I know you're going to want to identify with the victims, or that's how you're going to see this experience, but I want you to look at it through the eyes of the perpetrators, because they were quote normal people, and if you don't have the imagination to understand how normal people can do that, then we're not going to solve these problems. But
and by the way, the director of the Buchenwald Museum, who's a terrifically thoughtful, intelligent guy who I interviewed at length, actually contrasting with an interview that I did with Bryan Stevenson, and comparing the two of them, that is exactly what Knigge, the director, wants to focus on. That's the focus of, you maybe saw the old exhibit, because the new exhibit was just put in about 2 years ago, but it really is about the normality of the perpetrators and the way Weimar, 5 miles down the road, kept up a very normal life in the middle of this.
Right. Let's talk a little. We're going to open it up for questions in a sec, but to sort of tee that up, I know we all want to I know we're all, or many of us are contemplating the post-Trump America, and I'm just wondering whether whether there are any, and Germany obviously deals with these cyclical resurgences of neo-Nazism, as we do, honestly. And I'm just wondering if you can think of any lessons in how we might deal with it. Maybe there's no way to short circuit the 20-year fallow period of like denial, but Trumpism is still going to be here. So, and I'm just wondering, just to be specific about something, would a Fox News be able to exist in Germany?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not.
Would a Fox News be able to exist in Germany? Because that's, to me, is what has weaponized the perpetually aggrieved, 30% of the electorate, and without defanking that, I don't know.
I mean, here's another plug for the German media and for the way that they do things over there. People complain about high taxes in Europe. Well, one of the things that the taxes go to support is state-sponsored, excellent media. There are a couple of private stations, but most people get, their news as well as their entertainment. And you pay a little tax. I think it's about roughly $50 a year. Every family has to pay it. And for that, you get super radio programs. I mean, long form interviews and discussions on all kinds of things. And no, we have nothing even approaching Fox News. But it's not just because, in a way they're, Germans are better in some sense. But, there's, Rupert Murdoch has interests, financial and otherwise, that are being served by this. And if we had a really robust public media, there wouldn't be the kind of Fox News that there is. So that's the first thing. I mean, the second thing is, look, I hate it when I'm asked to speak about anything. I feel like I was introduced as a moral philosopher. It's kind of a weird word, but I'll answer to that. I do actually, a lot of people call me that, so I'm not objecting.
I'll take it. I'm a moral scold.
Moral scold is, I take moral philosopher a little strange, but anyway, I feel like if I am going to ask people to spend their very precious time listening to me talk about something, I really want to give some kind of a message of, I wouldn't call it optimism. I think optimism is the wrong word to use, but orientation, a sense. I hate intellectuals who kind of tell you all the reasons why we're going to hell in a handbasket, and I don't do it. This is obviously an introduction to my saying what I'm worried about. We have a right-wing party in Germany, but we also have gun laws, and I am concerned that it won't be a simple democratic transition. Okay. And I think that is something that those of us who are yearning for the transition to happen really need to think about very carefully. This man has left his mark not just on this country, but on the entire world. There's no place you can go and escape him, actually. It's something you only realize if you live abroad. First of all, they talk about American news all the time. And secondly, the fact that the President of the United States thinks he can do this, that, and the other thing has meant that, from Boris to Bolsonaro, An awful lot of people, America still, it's so interesting, but America really still does have this kind of role model function. Even as people are shaking their heads and being appalled at what's coming out of the White House, if it was permissible, if it's permissible for the Americans, then it's got to be permissible elsewhere. I forget what your question was exactly. I mean, I have a hopeful thing to say.
Yeah. Or I guess it would be how do you predict we will, and how should we process what the country has been through if we get through it?
I think we are on the road to processing it now. I think all of the things that we, that I mentioned, from the 1619 project, which is getting a huge amount of play, to, reparations discussions. I think we're actually doing okay on that score. I think we have to make sure that the nightmare is over. So here's my idea. And I'm just throwing it out to everybody that I talk to, because it's nice to write a book that people are interested in and all that. And, that's satisfying. But I was trying to think, is there some good that I can do about this? And I combined some experiences of, I'm afraid, the historical utter ignorance of, let's say, under 35s that I ran into in some particular occasions recently. And I'm talking about educated journalists who don't know, let's just take these two things, looked blank at the words Kristallnacht and looked blank at the words Freedom Summer. Okay? And one of the things that I loved in my interview with Bryan Stevenson was his saying, yes, we need to remember the lynchings, but we also need to remember the heroes. And there were white Southerners who were opposed to slavery and segregation, and we don't know their names. We need to know their names. I kind of assume I'm in an audience who knows the names of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, although, for those of you who are under 35, you might not. And it seems to me, with my friends who are teaching in universities and complaining about their students all want to be woke, but they're actually focusing on matters that are not entirely urgent, that a campaign to say, remember Goodman and Cheney and Schwerner, they died for the right to vote, and the most important thing that you can do in the next year is fight voter suppression.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's open it up. We only have 10 minutes left, and I also just want to say Susan's chapter on her encounter with James Meredith, who desegregated the Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, and sort of triggered a Second World War, is Civil War. Oh, did I say World War? Civil War. That's where my head is worth the price of the book. She eats pizza with him with Fox News on in the background. It's the best. So, all right. So, yes.
Thank you, Diane.
Hello. I was just wondering, from your experience in Germany, I just spent a lot of time there, and from what I could tell from their documentaries, it seems to concentrate on after the war and what the parents went through, but not necessarily what caused the war. Go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, that's the point.
You saw Our Fathers, Our Mothers, which was a very controversial mini TV series. I thought it was very good. You didn't see enough, because actually it is now the case that my 3 Jewish children complained at times that they heard too much about the war and the Holocaust in school, on television, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this was a corrective to the fact that people who grew up, people who went to school in the 50s and 60s would say, history stopped in 1933. Their children, many of them became teachers, and, insisted on correcting that. It is only now, that series is about 4 years old, I would say. It's only now that they feel that they have done some work that on facing the Holocaust and the Nazi atrocities, that they're turning to try to understand the perpetrators, as Diane was saying, and look at what their very, ordinary parents went through on the Eastern Front and the different choices that they made without in any sense being monstered. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, one of the things about growing up in the segregated South is that you definitely understand good Germans, because we all went along with something that was manifestly evil and went against our dearly held religious teachings. So that's easy for Southerners to understand. Richard? Oh. Sorry about that.
Hi.
Yeah.
I want to take off on the universality aspect of this because I'm not sure we're going far enough. I think that it starts to be important now to understand the human tendency to think in terms of self and other. And if you look through history, to understand that concept of not only that, all of us who sort of judge others sort of look inside with that aspect too. That's one thing. The second thing is by specifying, and I'm not saying we should discredit the conversation as it exists now in reparations and so forth, but to continually talk about the words that are basically anti-humanistic. In other words, we're not really just focusing on Jews or gays or people of color. What we're doing is they're anti-humanist statements. So it doesn't matter what the statement is and how it's formed. It's a question of what is that tendency in ourselves. And then the third part is that our culture now, the world culture, is so interconnected that if any discriminatory person was to deny a product or a service from that type of person that they dislike, their lives would start to collapse. And basically, we're at a point in history, like it or not, we basically have to accept the other because we will not be able to function.
I agree with you, certainly, that we're in a major anti-humanist moment. And I'm glad that you spoke up in the other direction. I see lots of people, so I don't want to answer it at too much length.
Thank you.
Can I talk now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm interested in the subject of starting points. Diane, you mentioned 1965 as a starting point, and it seems like we have two cases where, and I'll use American triumphalism here in saying this, you've got two cases where evil was defeated by the United States Army. And in one case, it took 100 years to get to the civil rights movement. And now, so if you start at 1965, you're leaving behind everything that happened up to that. If we are still where we are now, 150 years later, compared to what the Germans have done in 65 years, what hope is there for us?
Lots. So look, the interesting thing that occurred to me recently, Reconstruction happened when federal troops occupied the South and kept down the Klan and, instituted all kinds of civil rights. And then they were withdrawn, I have had Germans say to me, fortunately, the occupation was long here. Now, that's not to say that you can really do this work from the outside, because a lot of Germans, that is, it can't be imposed. Germans, West Germans anyway, made fun of denazification, and they thought the Americans were stupid and they didn't get it, and so on and so on. But what you had is you couldn't form groups like the Klan or groups of Wehrmacht soldiers who were possibly violent but certainly radically right. Okay. And we had all that during Reconstruction. We lost it, which is an interesting fact. But I really do take Diane's point about 1965 because, so look, I think white people had a 100-year hole in our history. And I speak both for myself until I started working on this project. I knew like a little bit, but basically the time between 1865 and Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott was not a part of my consciousness. And just to exonerate me from any particular ignorance, there was a moment during the 2016 election when Hillary Clinton, who was certainly an educated woman, was asked who her favorite president was. Well, guess who? Of course, she said Abraham Lincoln. And she said because if he hadn't been assassinated, there wouldn't have been all that mess with Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And I guess I'd already started to work on the book then. And I said, wait, this highly educated woman is just saying, oh, all that mess, right? Well, it's history that we never faced. Hollywood began basically with Birth of a Nation. It was by no means just the South. And it wasn't just Birth of the Nation and Gone with the Wind. I looked up, actually, in the process of doing this, how many pro-Confederate Hollywood films were made. And they were hugely popular. Okay. Here, I'll tell you another thing that freaked me out. I don't know what you think about this. It is so deep in the culture that I was driving along the highway and a song that I and presumably half the people in this room love, "A Night They Drove Old Dixie Down," came on the radio. And I thought, holy shit. This was the band, Bob Dylan's band. They were from Canada. Bob Dylan went down to Mississippi. I mean, his race activism is on the line. It was covered by Joan Baez, same there. And none of us thought we were singing this elegy for the Confederacy, So it's very deep in our culture. And it's something that, we didn't, in 1965, we abolished legal segregation, but we didn't begin to think about this stuff. We're thinking about it now, and I have a lot of hope.
Okay, let's take.
The election turns out right.
Yeah, let's take two more. We'll take both your questions, and she'll try to answer both.
Okay,
yeah.
Mine is going to be the tough question.
Okay.
I don't know. That's my brother. He'll be tough too.
Okay, no.
That means it'll be a softball.
I'm Palestinian American. I arrived at age 5 in the States back in the 50s. And I find Israeli attitudes, towards Palestinians like the white man's attitude towards blacks here in this country. You look at settlers coming in from New York or wherever, taking over people's land, displacing people, and they don't seem to see it. The Israeli Arabs can't even express their identity as Palestinians. They're called traitors. So what are the lessons? Because, Edward Said said, it's sad to say, but we're victims of victims.
That's not a hard question for me because I basically agree with you. And my Israeli friends are working intensely and often under physical danger in the territories together with Palestinians to work against, to basically often protecting Palestinians from the settlers, I decided myself that I wasn't going to support BDS, but I was going to, if I ever go to Israel, I was going to make sure that I go down with a civil rights group that is basically working on the principles of Martin Luther King. I would at least spend some time in the territories and see what the situation is, because part of the problem is ordinary Israelis, even if they're on the left, don't actually see how bad it is, because there was this, it's politically incorrect to go to the view was, when I lived in Israel, those are occupied territories, we shouldn't be occupying them. I'm talking about the left in Israel, which would be my friends, people in the peace movement, people with Shalom Achshav, and other groups breaking the silence. And so not setting foot in the territories was seen to be the right thing to do, except you don't see how bad it is, and you can't tell from reading the news. So basically, I agree with you.
Okay, bro, take it away.
So I remember when you first got to Berlin in the early 80s, talking about on this subject, the difference between the East Berliners and the West Berliners. And you just mentioned again, in reference to a different question, how the West Berliners reacted toward denazification. So I'm wondering, A, is my memory correct of how East Germans and West Germans were? Why did they approach this issue differently? And what lessons can be taken for this country on that issue?
I love that question.
It wasn't a plant.
No, it wasn't. And the thing is, I just gave him a book last night when I arrived in Baltimore. So he only read the first chapter. There is a whole chapter on that subject, but
You have to give the Cliff Notes version because we're about to get the hook, right?
Let me try to answer it quickly. Because the Germans first, your memory is correct, because the Nazis' first victims were communists. When the war ended, the leadership of East Germany were people who had either spent the war in a concentration camp or spent the war in exile in Moscow. So what that means is they really were anti-fascists. Quite a few of them were Jews, but that wasn't what was central. They were deeply anti-fascist, and they had suffered for it, okay? So certain things that it took West Germany 40 years to say, like, yeah, we suffered, but other people suffered worse, and it was our fault, took 40 years for somebody in the German government to make that statement. The East Germans made it from the beginning. And it took 40 years for the German government to call May 8th, the end of the war, a day of liberation instead of a day of unconditional surrender or a day of defeat or a day of mourning. It was a day of liberation from the beginning. Now, what sometimes, and everybody had to take it was taught in the schools, the Holocaust was taught in the schools, the war was taught in the schools. Students, every student had to, I think it was 10th grade, take a trip to Buchenwald. There were lots of films made. It was a very strong message. Now, it was sometimes used instrumentally. The very worst case was when they built the wall, they called it the anti-fascist protection wall. Okay. So they did, instrumentalize that. But I talked to a lot of people interviewing them on that question. And I only interviewed, with one exception, people who had been in the opposition in East Germany. So people who also put something on the line. They were not by no means just defenders of the party line. And they said, there are a lot of things that I didn't like about the DDR, about East Germany, but that they did right. That was okay. I met people who said, I owe my life to the Red Army, okay? And it was, by the way, the Red Army that won the war. Americans like to think it was Normandy. Brits like to think it was the RAF. 13 million Soviet soldiers gave their lives to end fascism. I'm not not knocking the sacrifice that was made in Normandy and the RAF pilots, but we need to put it in some relation. What I've come to think is that you had exactly opposite processes going on in East and West Germany. In East Germany, the leadership said the Nazis were bad, and mea culpa, okay? But there have been people who say it, because it was all over the place, you didn't have enough sort of granular bottom-up confronting, talking about the experience that you had in the East and the West. In the West, of course, it was opposition to the government. The government called people who wanted to remember the Nazi past Netzbeschmutzer, nest foulers, people who are dirtying their own nest. I'm sure you've heard this before, but Americans who hate America. And what I've come to think is if you could put the two together, if you could have both real leadership, a top-down and a bottom-up process, then you would have the real thing. That's what would be needed. But yeah, that's the potted answer. It's a really interesting subject, though.
So I'm going to leave you with a quote from Susan's book that really stuck with me. It's from Bettina Stangnet, who was what would you call her?
She's a philosopher and a historian.
And just take this with you when we start hearing about all the whataboutism going forward from this moment about, well, they did this, they did this. She said to Susan when you were like pushing back on something, she says, if the soup is too salty, the soup is too salty. It doesn't matter if you can't get better soup anywhere else. So just think about it.
That was great.